Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us again at the European SDG Summit for its fourth consecutive day. And this is for us an important and innovative event. And if I can have the next slide. Because usually we do this type of summits for our network of partners, companies and national partners, and you see here on the next slide. You see our network of companies and partners, and also on the next one, the associate partners. So usually we do this for our inner group, but COVID forced us actually to do it differently, and then to rethink and to reconsider. So we made it a more open event, and also with some technical hiccups always around, but a more open and inclusive event, and with the purpose of having a gathering of all the change makers. And this change actually fits very well CSR Europe strategy. In 2019, we made this new 2030 strategy with 3 focus areas: people, materials, and markets. Also with the idea not only to work towards our member companies and the companies that are member of our national partners, but also, and that is what our president last Monday launched, with industry federations and with wider groups of stakeholders, because the change we need, and you saw that in that little film before, is necessary, and that's why we launched the Pact for Sustainable Industry. But today, our focus is on environmental protection and human rights due diligence in supply chain. And they bring, actually, that topic brings together those 3 priority areas of people, materials, and markets. Because if we talk about that topic, we talk about the type of products we bring to the market and the way we produce them, and how that production and bringing it to the market affects people, their communities, their environments. It also depends on the type of materials we are using and how that in itself can be improved further. We all understand that this is a collaboration agenda. And CSR Europe itself has a number of collaborative efforts on this, and you see below some logos on that. Drive Sustainability is an automotive partnership that focuses a lot on, it's 11 automotive companies that focuses a lot on also on raw material sourcing and how to improve that and make that more sustainable. Or Extractives for Development is a project that we are doing to strengthen local sustainability networks in and around mining communities. So a lot is going on within CSR Europe, but outside. But it's, as I mentioned, a collaboration agenda, and that we would like to further explore today with you. Because striving towards sustainable supply chain is also high on the agenda of the European Commission. Last April, Mr. Anders announced, the Commissioner for Justice announced a plan for a mandatory environmental and human rights due diligence regulation that will entail a mandatory approach, that will also entail, and the discussions are ongoing, a civil and even maybe criminal liability, corporate liability. But we see a number of merits in it, but we see a number of challenges in it. Challenges like, how will an individual company reporting, will it lead to more engagement of the company, especially the downstream companies, or will it lead to more avoidance of tackling issues? And does an individual company in its own right has enough leverage to change the situation? And because the causalities of the issues at hand, environmental or human rights related, are maybe too complex that can be tackled by individual companies. So that's why in the discussions we are having within our network, we talk always about the smart mix approach, and that is exactly the topic of this session. And we want to understand together with you better what are the building blocks then of such a smart mix approach. We don't want to discuss today not about the law itself, but more on the key question: what is needed for impact and for change in terms of policy coherence from different areas? It's not a matter only of justice, but it's a matter of trade, of public procurement, of international collaboration, on competition, etc., competition policies. It's also an issue related to finance. How can we have better forms of impact investment and finance related to capacity building towards improvement programs? And what are then better or more suited public-private initiatives? And because what we see now that they are maybe too scattered around or too in a type of pilot type of approach. And a last element that we think is necessary is, and I think that the German presidency that is ongoing for the European Union for the moment explored already that topic, and we'll also talk about it today in our conference, the concept of European sector dialogues. So it's a matter about engagement, probably engagement towards continuous improvement on the ground, but also engagement towards breakthrough innovation that is needed. So that's what we want to explore with you today. What is that smart mix? And what does it mean to be smart on that to reach the impact that we need, that we all strive for? We have a strong lineup of speakers. You have seen that on the agenda for today. And it's on purpose we have invited a very strong and good non-European representation in our panel today. And I would thank all the people in the panel already up front, because it's important that when we have this debate on global sustainable supply chains, it's not only, certainly not a Brussels debate, but and certainly also not a European debate only. So I thank really the speakers coming from all parts of the world to contribute today. And without further ado, I would like now to give the floor to our president, Mr. Davignon, to welcome our keynote speakers. Mr. Davignon, the floor is yours.
So thank you everybody for being here, and I will try, as Stefan has indicated, to help us to be as practical as possible. When we opened our meetings on Monday, Didier Renders was one of the key speakers and told us that he was starting this week a wide consultation of enterprises and stakeholders relating to the future EU regulation on sustainable corporate governance, strong focus on corporate duty to integrate human rights and environmental across the supply chains, exactly the topic that we are dealing with today. But he also clearly indicated that this had to be put in context. And the context, as you see it, is Europe's recovery plan. Also, maybe the more general debates about where is the EU going, the so-called next generation EU. And of course, trade policy and arrangements which are directly impacted by these issues. And what is the international cooperation and development strategy of the EU? So we're not only speaking about due diligence, we're speaking about how, who, how, and what are the practical engagements that need to be taken, and how do we develop the collaboration without which solutions on the ground will be very unsuccessful. So to help us in this debate, we have the privilege today of having with us Mrs. Rania Al-Mashat, who is the Minister of International Cooperation of Europe. We are very grateful to you for having accepted our invitation to learn from you how you are creating in Egypt the momentum, how with your own companies and of course with European-based companies, how can we do and include our objectives of growth, including the green elements which have become essential for our planet. And so we need to forge more collaboration across Europe, and that is across Egypt, that is what you are responsible for, but also to ensure that Egypt and Europe develop enterprises and communities on the ground. Practical is really the issue which we are trying to understand. And of course, to partner this presentation, we have the pleasure of having with us the Director General of International Cooperation and Development of the Commission, Mr. Koen, and we clearly see that your leadership in this area will indicate and plan what is the context in which all these collaborations have to be developed. Because without context, collaborations become purely pragmatic, and that is not enough. They have to implement, and awareness is necessary, capacity building is indispensable, and local collaboration and partnerships is, of course, what is needed to be practical. So, with this introduction, I would like to ask you, Madam Minister, to introduce our debate. And thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much for the kind invitation. And given that you extended the invitation to more than the partners, the typical partners you're used to, just shows how the pandemic has truly shifted in the different ways, whether it's governments, policymakers, citizens, or businesses think about the current challenges. The topic is put in the framework of global supply chains, and all of us realize that that is an extremely important topic right after the pandemic, of course, because there has been a lot of different types of interruptions, but more importantly, innovation and communication has eased some of that. Pleased to be joining this conversation and debate. And what we have realized from the pandemic is that, again, the number of engagements across, whether it's within Europe, across Europe, includes more than just the local developments. Anyways, the importance of the pandemic has put a new normal on all of us, and that is that no entity is by itself. If we're talking about governments, nobody has the silver bullet. Nobody has the solution. If we're talking about businesses, it's the same. If we're talking about citizens and civil society, it's also the same. So what is extremely important today is that the challenges have become extremely tangible, and nobody can overlook the implications of trying to go through growth without bearing in mind the sustainability impacts. And that's why when we look at the different SDGs, they actually provide the common denominator that can bring all these stakeholders together. And what is the video that was presented has shown a decade of action. When 2020 started, we had 10 years until 2030 to be able to achieve the different SDGs that most countries had adhered to in 2015 under the United Nations. And what is extremely significant today is that there's a realization from businesses that in order to be convincing to the customers, to the clients, to the different constituencies they are addressing, that those SDGs have to also be part of their DNA, if you will, or part of their planning. And that's why this metric, environment, social, and governance, the ESG metric, is one that is being endorsed by several CEOs globally. And what is very important from a government side is to try and create through legal frameworks a conducive platform for different firms and different companies to be able to push these principles forward. When I take a look at, and it was mentioned, international cooperation as a ministry here in Egypt, our role is to try to bring together all the stakeholders. So through our role as, and I summarize it in one word, promoting economic diplomacy, we do that through three principles. A key one of them is the multi-stakeholder platforms, where we have the private sector, civil society, our development partners come together to be able to discuss different development projects, so that in the design, we take into account many of the global principles, but also that there's complementarity between the different partners. The other is related to creating a narrative, a global partnerships narrative, which is well understood, transparent, and appealing to both businesses and consumers, or businesses and citizens, and people is at the core of that. So that narrative is people and projects and purpose. People at the core, projects and actions, and purpose as the driver, and the purpose are the SDGs. And finally, doing an ODA SDG mapping. And this is extremely important. many or a lot of the development finance that comes to the country is not only implemented by national companies, but private sector plays a very big role. So in trying to publicize these projects in a certain context and make sure that they are consistent with different SDGs is extremely important. I will just conclude by saying that the world has moved from shareholder capitalism to stakeholder capitalism, and that means that the process is inclusive. All of us are in it together. When we say public-private partnerships, another P is that people at the core of these partnerships. And this is something which government, through its different, creating frameworks and pushing the different stakeholders to move forward. There's also that realization that more businesses are getting engaged in ESGs. More businesses want to actually take pride in being able to think about the planet and about the people in a more conducive and constructive manner. And this is, again, as was mentioned in the video early on, it is not just for the good of the planet, but it's also for the good of the companies themselves. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this very interesting and encouraging approach, for which we thank you, and please feel free to participate in the discussion as we go along. Now I'd like to call on the Director General of International Cooperation and Development of the Commission, Mr. Kunduz. I'm happy that you are with us today. Thank you for taking the time. I hope we will make you will feel that you are using your time usefully, because we are absolutely convinced that capacity building and collaboration between private, public, and civil society is an issue for which will be very important in the next decade to support European companies to implement the future EU law, which Mr. Renders has indicated to us is now being put in place with the consultation. So we are delighted to hear from you. We're delighted to have the indispensable support that you will have to give the enterprises if we want to be all successful together. And with that, please take the floor.
Thank you very much. And I hope you can all hear and see me from my telework setup. No, it's really for me a pleasure to be here, because what you are discussing here today and yesterday is of great importance already, but I would say even growing importance for what we do, what we try to do in the Commission, my Commissioner, myself, with the rest of the world. And where indeed, if we look at the international partnerships we are building to basically project a certain idea that Europe has of the world based on this Commission's political agenda, very much involves the private sector and the way in which the private sector engages across the globe in our partner countries. So maybe before turning to the more specific subject of this session on sustainable supply chains, I would like to just seize the occasion to set maybe a bit of a broader picture on recovery from the pandemic, which has really become the reference point for the Commission's wider approach to sustainability. I mean, the next generation EU recovery plan, to which you have made reference, underlines the importance of a sustainable recovery from the COVID crisis. Not just any recovery, but a sustainable one that is green, that is digital, that is socially inclusive, that is resilient. And that goes for the EU itself, but it also goes for the way in which we would like to see that global recovery post-COVID happen at a global scale. And the EU and our member states, we have mobilized quite ambitious financing in a rather short time when COVID hits the world in our innovative Team Europe approach, which basically means that the EU and the member states work collectively as a team. And it has been very helpful in helping partner countries to address the immediate impact of the health crisis, but also very important to look at the immediate social and economic impacts, and now at trying to reboot the economies in a sustainable way. So to use the way in which UN Secretary General Guterres coined it at the time a few months ago, it is ultimately about build back better, helping our partner countries on a transformational path that helps to bring them closer to respect of the Paris Agreement on climate change and the Sustainable Development Goals. It's evident that as we do this, the private sector plays a crucial role. All of this cannot just be done by public authorities and with public funding. The way in which the private sector engages on this, the rules and standards it sets itself, or it follows when they are set for it, are a key element in making sure that recovery is indeed fit for purpose for the future. What we are doing in my area of work is precisely to go and try to be extremely supportive of this. We are currently finalizing the negotiations on the next generation of our financial instruments, on the next multi-annual financial framework, and within that, the new instrument for international cooperation and the neighborhood, the NDICI. We still hope, by the way, to change the name of that instrument. But in any case, what the instrument foresees is quite a substantial investment framework that will allow us to mobilize substantial financial resources to leverage private investments. It is captured in a fund, the European Fund for Sustainable Development Next Generation, basically 2.0, which will be the key tool we use to support micro-enterprises, small and medium-sized enterprises, to strengthen infrastructure in our partner countries, to develop renewable energy, to boost digital economy, to develop sustainable agriculture, strategic interconnectivity, and so on. So all these elements, all these underlying policy frameworks that are so crucial for this Build Back Better recovery, working with the private sector. And if we do that together, collectively, we are working intensely more and more with the European private sector and with the private sector in our partner countries. We are sure that a combination of what we can bring with public funding, with ODA, combined with, let's say, the interventions of our European development finance institutions, with which we can blend funding or provide guarantees for innovative financial instruments, that ultimately we can generate together an impact on the ground that can really make a change for the better. In order to address also some of the more systemic global financing challenges, we are, by the way, also working within the EU and internationally to promote a more sustainable financial system, to avoid greenwashing, and to help our partners to mobilize capital towards environmentally sustainable projects. You know about the taxonomy, you know about the International Platform for Sustainable Finance, and we are rolling this gradually out in more and more partner countries. So to sum it up, all in all, if you look at what we will be doing over the next generation of our financial instruments, the next coming years, it will provide really substantial, significant opportunities for private sector engagement. And we are actually actively looking into that, because I think that there is a real win-win to be found there. Obviously, rather than partnering with individual companies on specific pilot projects, we try to use the scale of our intervention as policy setters, as standard setters, to create enabling conditions for companies to thrive and to engage in a responsible manner. And it's precisely the scale of our collective engagement as Team Europe that gives us the power to convene multiple stakeholders beyond such a common purpose. That brings me maybe to the more specific topic of this session today, on the next frontier of mandatory corporate environment and human rights due diligence. I mean, as Commissioner Reinders announced in the plenary on the first day, the Commission is proposing indeed, or will be proposing, an initiative on sustainable corporate governance, which covers both directors' duties of care and the corporate due diligence obligations. And the 2021 Commission Work Programme, which was adopted recently, envisages this legislative initiative for the second quarter of next year. And we really think that this initiative has the potential to contribute or even achieve a really system-level change to more sustainable business practices. And it will not only serve, and this is important for me, not only serve the need to create, let's say, a level playing field and consistency for European companies, but also because the rules requiring companies to undertake social, human rights and environmental due diligence across the global supply chain will also have the potential to really significantly contribute to sustainable livelihoods, environmental protection, respect for human rights and labor standards in our partner countries across the globe. And that's again where, with development cooperation, we really want to play an important role in accompanying such possible corporate due diligence obligation with support to the integration of local businesses into the supply chains of European lead firms, and to help you all meet and benefit from those sustainability requirements. We are doing quite a lot already currently in the field, for instance, of responsible mining, in the garment sector, or very recently a very ambitious but well-constructed initiative on cacao, where I think we have learned already how through such successful examples, EU development cooperation can indeed effectively accompany and reinforce regulatory measures at the EU level, ultimately benefiting both the private sector and our partner countries. The proposal for this sustainable corporate governance initiatives comes at a time when calls for this mandatory due diligence for companies are stronger than ever before, and we see how they're not only coming from our own member states, from civil society, but also from you, from the private sector itself, from companies who want to do this, and who indeed obviously then call for a level playing field in Europe amongst those businesses, but also for support in partner countries to make this really happen and workable in the benefit also for their economic and economic partners, private sector and stakeholders. And so we are really committed to taking the views of all stakeholders into account when we will be preparing this new initiative, and we will be working hard with the international community to improve the environments, the systems within which such sustainable business can thrive. I've mentioned a couple of concrete examples. We will hope through this kind of engagement with all of you to be able to scale that up in a very concrete matter in the most important economic sectors for our partner countries over the next 7 years. The programming of our development funding from that point of view is essential, and that's what we will be spending quite a lot of time on over the next, let's say, 7-8 months. So many thanks for having given me the occasion to speak to you, and very keen to follow the rest of the debate. Thank you very much. Over to you.
Thank you very much. And I was particularly interested by what you've said on everything which is relating to the financial context. As you well know, this has been a complicated issue for a long time, And it is a complicated issue. So it's important to see that there's leadership coming, that there is practical proposals, and that we can overcome the technicalities, because if we don't have the capacity to invest, a great number of our initiatives will be pilot projects and not across the board. Secondly, I would like to thank you for your attitude towards cooperating with private business. This has not always been the case in member states or in international organizations where there was some sort of resistance to and believe that there would be an immediate conflict of interest and so on and so forth. I think we have to be practical, and I think the way in which you have shown us the direction in which you are going is most encouraging. And from the side of the private sector, we welcome this, and we will play our part by very much following the norms and the suggestions that you've given. We are happy with the proposal that Commissioner Reinders indicated, and that is why we will be most active in the consultation process so that the results would come from the ground. So thank you very much for this, and we will now continue the debate, and I will hand over the moderation to Stefan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Davignon, and also thank you, Mr. Doens and Minister Al-Mashad, for your time and for the insights you provided us. And the next part of the session is called Conversation with Leaders. And actually, my personal concept of leadership is a concept of engagement. We heard the word before, also Koen and the minister mentioned it before. It's about people who engage, people who do the practical work, people who experience the challenges day by day, people who fail, but also people who can bring impact and change together with their teams. And I think I'm therefore all the more delighted to hand over the moderation to a leader in the field we are discussing today. Estelle Levin is CEO and founder of Levin Sources. Levin Sources was founded in 2010 as a catalyst to facilitate better business and good governance, mainly in the minerals sector. And she's an international recognized leader, especially on artisanal and small-scale mining. Estelle, really thank you for accepting our invitation to moderate this session, and I give the floor to you.
Stefan, thank you very much. It's such a privilege to be here. And I would like to say that I am certainly a European at heart, if not in passport, making it even more of an honor to facilitate and moderate this session. So thank you. If we could just move to the slide so that I can get to the more interesting panelists than myself and introduce my esteemed colleagues who will be speaking. First will be Dr. Johan van Zyl, who's the President and CEO of Toyota Motor Europe. Mrs. Mariam Dalgabala is the Chairperson of the International Supervisory Board of the International NGO of SOLIDARIDAD, and she is also the President of the Coalition of Female Leaders of Côte d'Ivoire. Mr. Ken Banda is the Tanzania Country Representative of international NGO Ricolto. Mr. Sun Lihu is the Director of the Chinese Chamber of Commerce for Minerals, Metals and Chemicals. And then Mr. Aidan Davey, who's the Chief Operating Officer of the International Council for Mining and Metals. Thank you to all of you. Dr. Van Zyl, if I could turn to you first, please.
Good morning. Firstly, thank you for the opportunity to share with you some thoughts about the supply chain, and specifically the supply chain we are dealing with, of course, in the automotive industry, and then specifically Toyota. Can I just get the slides, please? Now, Toyota has been involved in, committed to the environment and respect for people since the establishment of our company in 1937 by Satiichi Toyota. And of course, we are committed to the SDGs. And it's evident in our public linkage with the SDGs and also environmental challenge which we've set for ourselves for 2050 and our 2030 milestones. And recently, our President Akio Toyoda has made a very strong statement to say that nobody will be left behind with the changes that we foresee in future. So if we could go to the next slide, please. We have a very, very complicated supply chain which we as you can see on this slide, we've got 9 manufacturing facilities in Europe. And then we've got 700 tier 1 suppliers. And an average car takes about 25,000 parts. And of course, you then can move down in the tiers up to tier 25. And that would mean that we'll have more than 300,000 or 30,000 suppliers. So how do we manage this? We utilize in Europe, we work together with our suppliers through a project called TEAM. And in this, we make sure that we share our values and sustainability guidelines with our suppliers. We do direct supplier support and development. We create collaborative networks between the suppliers and, of course, sharing best practice. But the most important thing is, of course, people development and building supply capacity. Next slide, please. But that's what we can do. From a global point of view and sectorial point of view, we also collaborate, and that's where we work together as a sector through drive sustainability. And if you really look at the challenges which we face as an industry, it's huge challenges, and it's the kind of challenges you face in once in 100 years, our president has said. So we've got challenges where we need to develop new supply chains in terms of new sustainable materials. We need to look at CO2, greenhouse gases, the impact, of course, on climate change, stepping up to make a real circular economy, and then respecting the members and the labor's rights in our supply chains and also the workforce. So therefore, we find driving sustainability, the consortium of OEMs is a very useful platform to utilize to collaborate and discuss and find best practice in terms of sharing information and experiences with each other. And this can, of course, only happen on non-competitive aspects of our business. We cannot collaborate and share best practice when it comes to business aspects. And then, of course, avoid confusion in supply chains, where we really want to establish true standards coming with one voice, not each OEM going to a supplier with a different kind of requirement or standard. And then collaborate also with other industries, for instance, with the rubber industry, which is not part, which is, of course, also part of our supply chain. And then, of course, improving efficiencies by working together on really making sure that, for instance, when it comes to data collection for CO2, that we could collaborate. And that is one of the examples where we, as an industry, has been working together quite effectively. And then the next slide, please. If I could just say that, we, as Toyota, would like to go beyond zero. Not just to zero, but we can only do this together in a collaborative spirit. We cannot, as Toyota, do it by ourselves. We need the collaboration of the supply chain and also not just downstream, but also upstream collaboration. And then the only way we can achieve this is to really work together. So thank you.
Dr. Van Zyl, thank you very much. If I could just ask you a question about electrification, which is very topical. How is that putting more challenges on you for building more sustainable supply chains? How is collaboration supporting you in tackling those challenges?
Well, I think when it comes to new technologies, we must also always find new raw materials, and we need to find new suppliers of these materials and then also develop them. So, for instance, when it comes to battery, there's cobalt that needs to be sourced, and that is a contentious one, which has also always been highlighted as a potential problem area. But as an industry, we can work together to ensure that this problem can be solved, like the problem was solved. I don't know if it's fully solved, but in the diamond industry, quite a big process. that could help.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Just a qualification, it's not quite solved in diamonds, but there has been an awful lot of progress, also due to collaboration. Thank you very much, Dr. Mr. Delgabala, if I could please turn to you now to share your intervention. Thank you.
Thank you. I feel honored and privileged to participate to this 2020 European SDG Summit and bring you a perspective from the South. Today, we all agree that clear regulation for sustainable production are needed. Legislation can be a blessing for European consumer, as it gives the consumer the comfort that the product they buy is truly sustainable, with no damage to the ecosystem and free of child labor. In formulating legislation, I would like to challenge the European Union to also look at the other side of the supply chain. Please, look at this lady, small cocoa farmer in Côte d'Ivoire, and ask yourself, what will be the side effect of this legislation on her life? Does she really profit from our good intentions? At this point, the experience of Solidaridad can enlighten our reflection. Solidaridad is one of the founders of fair trade 30 years ago. We started fair trade by assuming that consumers will be willing to pay a fair price for their coffee. Unfortunately, this appeared to be only partly true. Then we moved to a second phase with companies as drivers, assuming that if companies improve their due diligence and include fair trade principle, the impact will be more significant. This second assumption also appears only partly true. In fact, while corporate social responsibility has become a strong movement, real systemic change has not occurred. For Our Lady, small cocoa farmer in Côte d'Ivoire, little has changed. She moved to fair trade farming, hoping it will pull her out of poverty. But today, her income is still under €1 per day, while the cost and demand for certification are increasingly difficult to adhere to. To be certified, she needs to use specific pesticides, to store her production in a certain condition. Her grandchildren can't help on the farm, and on top of all these requirements, she has to pay auditors to remain certified. All these requirements for no drastic change in her revenue. From our experience, we believe that mandatory framework can be an important driver for more systemic change. However, this approach may also have unintended side effects, such as the exclusion of high-risk actors like this lady or high-risk regions like my country. As you may notice, with all these good intention, due diligence legislation may result in a clean supply chain linked to Europe without addressing the issue in producing countries like Côte d'Ivoire. At this stage, the question one should ask and answer is how can we organize this system in an inclusive way? From my African perspective, the answer will be, instead of only raising the bar, we need to raise the floor too in an in-depth inclusive process, including enriched farmers and enriched miners. We have to assure that this legislation is not a threat for producers, but that it safeguards continued market access also for the vulnerable. I firmly plea for an inclusive due diligence, and this required for me 4 things. First, pay attention to smallholder farmers and miners, in particular women, youth, and indigenous groups. Formulate and execute legislation in partnership with producing countries' governments. Third, address the issue of unequal value distribution. And finally, adopt a mix of measures and policy. To make this work, we need an effective interplay between the European Union, supply chain partners, producers, and consumers. Let's work together to ensure that due diligence does what it is supposed to do in the first place, provide a better future for the producers of our daily food and other products we consume. Let's create change that matter together. Thank you.
Mrs. Delgado, thank you so much. Your presentation really resonates with me because of the work that we've been doing with artisanal and small-scale miners around the world, and particularly in Central Africa with the focus of the Dodd-Frank legislation from the Americans, and also just many other nations focusing on Central Africa, and how that's led to the risk of exclusion of artisanal and small-scale miners there. So it really does speak to me. You mentioned women, youth, and indigenous peoples as perhaps vulnerable categories where we need to be intentional about how we can include them in this process. I wonder, do you see ways in which the new or the proposed European due diligence legislation can support the protection of rights for women, indigenous people, or youth, and improve equality in agricultural supply chains?
I think, Estelle, is all linked to an inclusive due diligence. When I say inclusive due diligence, it means that when you talk to farmers, you have to see farmers as men and women, because women in agriculture in Africa face different challenges than men. And for example, they do not have access to land and to finance. To land, let me give you a small example from my community. When you are adult in the community, you are given a land for farming, but this is only true for men. Women are not entitled to get that land. So it means that they are excluded from access to land, and if they want to have the land, they have to pay for it. So I think an inclusive due diligence, looking at producer in a gender way, will help to support women's rights and facilitate their access to the supply chain.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Delgado. If I could now, thank you. If I could now move to Mrs. Uganda, who's coming from East Africa rather than West Africa now. Kane, if I could pass to you, please, for your intervention. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Estelle. Thank you, CSR Europe, for giving me this opportunity to participate in this discussion. I'm going to present the way we are working in East Africa, especially working with the smaller farmers to be able to abide to sustainability principles. Ricoto East Africa is part of Ricoto Global, where the aim is really to support sustainable food production and consumption in order to respond to the growing population, but also to the growing cities. We are also trying really to ensure there is a fair relationship along the supply chain between producers, off-takers, and other chain actors. But also we are trying to support provision of healthy, sustainable, and nutrition food, regardless of the level of the income of the consumers. So I will speak about horticulture, especially where we are working as a case. In Tanzania, we are trying to address a number of challenges. As you can see that the horticulture, it has a lot of potential, especially in export, and is growing very rapidly. As you can see that it is employing over 450,000 smallholder farmers, and 70% of the employee in that sector are women. and it contributes a lot of earning in terms of export. And the main export destination is the Netherlands and Switzerland. As you can see that there are a number of commodities which we are exporting to those countries. There is a lot of challenges which we are trying to address. The first one is low productivity, the issue also of adherence to good agronomic practices, poor post-harvest handling. As you can see that the food loss could contribute especially to high carbon footprint, but also it contributed to high cost of produce, which affect the affordability to consumers. It also contributed to high cost of the production, which somehow also make the smaller farmers and not getting a fair share in the value chain. So there are a lot of constraints which we are trying to address, and what we are doing is really to enable farmers to be able to organize in farmer organization, and to be able to access different services like extension services, but also services related to finance and others which will make them abide to sustainability practices. We also support innovative ICT solution, especially on food distribution. As you can see that, especially during COVID, due to the restricted movement, ICT came to be a very good solution really to enable food distributed to the consumers. Also, we are supporting the issue of financial inclusion, including financial literacy, but also the major thing which you are supporting is to have a structured trading relationship between smallholder farmers and off-takers, and where in most cases we see smallholder farmers are the most marginalized. So we are trying really to build that kind of relationship which will benefit smallholder farmers. And in supporting that, there are a lot of issues we are trying to address, including the post-harvest loss, for example, supporting the aggregation and the grading centers to reduce the post-harvest loss due to the poor post-harvest handling, but also due to poor logistics. So collective aggregation centers are the one of the areas which we are trying to address. Next. Apart from working in supply chain, especially in trying really to create a fair relationship along the value chain, but also we are intervening in urban food system where we are trying to build evidence which will contribute to consumer awareness campaign in order to create the demand of healthily sustainable and nutrition food. And here the work is more on trying to do research and have good evidence which will convince farmers to consumers to demand produce. We are also trying to engage retailer to have innovative and efficient way of food distribution, to have a shorter chain. You know, sometimes the food, it passes through a lot of hands until when it reaches the consumers. There are a lot of inefficiencies in the distribution system. So the issue here is real to try to help the chain actors to come up with more solutions in terms of food distribution, which reduce food losses. It's not doing working alone, is working with others to make sure that we create solutions to different problems in supply chain. There are a lot of business cases which will enable companies to invest in sustainability practices. Then one of the incentive is if you come up with the price incentive in terms of products which are produced according to sustainability practices, but also the cost saving in terms of production. But also the company in emerging market benefit in all areas in terms of cost saving by adapting the environmental practices. But we see also if the consumers really will demand the products which are produced according to sustainability practices, the producer will adapt to those practices. And here you can see that consumer awareness campaign is a key, especially to a destination of those products. But also we see that the companies, by adapting to those practices, somehow strengthen their license to operate in those areas, since if there is penalty, then it means that they will close the business. But finally, by making the company to adapt in those sustainability practices, there are others who can support that in order for those companies. For example, the government is a key player, especially in emerging markets, in terms of providing good governance, regulatory framework, and the policy tools to enable the companies to adapt. But investors and the lenders, we see them also as a key actors, especially to make sure that whatever they do assessment in terms of investment, they make sure that the sustainability is one of the criteria in order to invest. But also customers, we see also, especially business customers in developing world, we see them as a key. But consumers, as I said earlier, that are very important in terms of paying premium price for the produce which are produced according to sustainability practices. But also finally, we see the NGOs also, they can put or they can apply appropriate pressures on companies and explore partnership involving business and the government and other key players in terms of supporting companies and other value chain actors to adapt to the sustainability practice. That is in short what I can say. Thank you very much for listening.
Mr. Vander, thank you so much. Very interesting, particularly for me on the retailers and farmers dialogue that you've been facilitating. I'm afraid in the interest of time, I'm going to have to move on to the next intervention. But there is time at the end, I can come back to you with my question. If I could move, please, at least to the intervention from Director Sun. Thank you very much.
尊敬的大会主席，各位女士们、先生们，各位领导、各位专家、各位伙伴们，大家好，我是中国五矿化工技术商会孙立慧，非常荣幸受邀参加2020年欧洲 SDG 峰会，通过在线方式同各位进行思想碰撞和经验分享。CCCMC 作为中国在金属、矿产、石油、化工、橡胶和轮胎领域规模最大的行业组织，拥有会员企业6500多家，先后编制了化工、矿产和天然橡胶行业社会责任标准和相关工具，组织开展了大量的培训，开展技术调查，编制国别风险报告，为政府提供政策建议，给企业提供技术支持，参与社区发展，开展多类型方磋商等工作，目的是帮助企业提高负责任的意识和能力，有效管控社会责任风险，为社区创造价值，努力实现联合国2030年可持续发展目标。由于时间关系，我仅向各位介绍在钴、天然橡胶和中国在非企业社会责任联盟3方面的主要工作。首先介绍在钴工业尽职管理方面的工作。我们知道钴是新能源电池不可或缺的关键原材料，全球60%的钴是来自钢镚金，且至少20%由手工开采。为了解决钢镚金钴手采矿存在的童工、安全等风险问题，2016年，五矿化工技术商会和经合组织在联合国工商业与人权论坛上牵头发起了责任钴倡议 RCI 引领企业采用系统性、包容性、持续性原则制定和实施解决方案，防止出现为了单纯减少供应链风险而采用简单终止合作的做法，以免加剧当地社区生计的恶化，得到了众多全球钴供应链上下游企业、政府、行业组织和非政府组织等等积极的支持和参与。RCI 制定了3大工作目标，分别是提高供应链透明度与治理能力，推动利益相关方合作与落地项目，促进多利益方沟通与示范案例的推广。我们通过制定钴冶炼厂供应链尽责管理标准， 与五供应链评估体系，开展系统性风险评估，识别行业企业存在的差距和问题，针对性的提供技术支持和培训等，推动成员企业逐步提升供应链风险管理能力与供应链的透明度。在刚果金落地行动方面，我们支持企业在刚果金开展了4个手采矿规范化治理项目，开展童工救济与学校建设，为周边社区提供生计多元化的技能培训，同 OECD 联合开展调研和培训，积极推动企业同刚果金政府、民间组织和受影响的当地社区开展合作。目前正在联合国际机构等共同开发钴的手采矿尽责管理体系，研究建立童工救济和社区生计的长效化机制等。在天然橡胶领域的工作，近年来，东南亚、非洲等区域天然橡胶的大面积无序种植成为会引起很大的驱动因素。中国是全球天然橡胶最大的进口国、最大的消费国和最大的投资国之一。为此，在推动解决天然橡胶可持续发展方面至关重要。为了驱动天然橡胶价值链变革，帮助天然橡胶企业识别、防范和管控对环境和社会产生的负面影响，2014年，中国不破坏供给商会联合国内外合作伙伴启动了可持续天然橡胶这个项目。该项目得到了中英政府林业投资与贸易可持续发展项目的大力支持。我们组织国际专家团队开发了可持续天然橡胶指南和配套的实施手册、评估工具等，成为全球天然橡胶领域第一部可持续发展标准，也成为驱动全球天然橡胶可持续性变革的重要动力。我们利用遥感、大数据和智能化方法，开发了天然橡胶风险预警和分析互动平台，把天然橡胶的各类风险可视化、数据化和模块化。我们为供应链上下游企业提供能力建设培训，提升供应链的透明度。面向小农户和种植园，我们通过编制小农户天然橡胶可持续性指南，开展知识分享和技能培训，支持小农户参与到可持续天然橡胶的商业模式，促进改善小农户的社区生计。我们同和盛农业签署合作谅解备忘录，组建国际专家团队，为其在喀麦隆的大型胶原打造示范性项目，推广优秀实践案例。联合湄公河区域的产业组织共同发起可持续天然橡胶价值链倡议，制定联合行动战略和联合行动计划，加强多利项网协作，共同探讨构建可持续天然橡胶价值链的方法和路径。第三，再向各位介绍一下中国在非企业社会责任联盟。2018年，中非合作论坛北京峰会盛大召开，中国国家主席习近平在大会主旨演讲中主动提出支持成立中国在非企业社会责任联盟，并写入中非合作论坛北京行动计划。鉴于 CCCMC 在社会责任领域的良好实践，中国政府部门同意由 CCCMC 牵头开展联盟筹建工作，承担联盟的秘书处职能。联盟的宗旨是打造中国在非企业履行社会责任的沟通交流平台、行动促进平台、能力提升平台和传播推广平台，增强企业社会责任意识，提升治理能力，培育优秀实践案例，促进非洲经济、社会和环境的协调发展以及民生改善，深化中非共建“一带一路”，实现联合国2030年可持续发展目标做出贡献。截至目前，已经有超过1500多个在非洲的中资企业、41个在非洲的中资企业协会商会等自愿成为首批会员，覆盖了50个非洲国家。联盟将协调中国在非洲的主要投资领域，诸如能源矿产、工程建设、林业农业、纺织鞋服、电子通信、医药保健、大型园区等，共同制定行为准则和行动计划。迄今为止，中国在非企业社会责任联盟是第一个由中国最高层领导者提出的社会责任的专业机构，具有里程碑意义。我很幸运参与其中。我们工作取得的成绩离不开全球合作伙伴的积极支持，在此表示衷心的感谢。预祝各位身体健康，工作顺利，预祝会议取得圆满成功。感谢大家的聆听。
Well, thank you to Director Sun Lihui for his intervention. I'm sorry that he couldn't be with us in person, but the technology proved too challenging to make that possible. Aidan Davey, if I could please pass to you for your intervention now.
Thanks, Estelle, and thanks to the organisers for the invitation. Just very quickly, ICMM is an international organisation that's dedicated to a safe, fair and sustainable mining and metals industry. And we bring together 27 mining and metals companies and over 35 national, regional and international commodities association members. And the sole focus is on strengthening environmental and social performance and serving as a catalyst for change. Our members collectively account for somewhere between 30 and 40% of major mined commodities globally, which represent a primary input to many material supply chains. One question I sometimes get asked is, what relevance does mining and metals have to the UN SDGs? But in practice, numerous studies, including many funded by the UN, indicate that the realization of many SDGs will be metals and minerals intensive. So meaningful progress on climate action or clean and affordable energy will be metals and minerals intensive. The same is true for clean water, sanitation, sustainable cities, or industry innovation and infrastructure. More broadly, the revenues that flow from developing a country's mineral resources provide governments with the necessary funds to progress many other SDGs. But while the products of mining and revenues from mineral development have an important role in delivering the SDGs, if mining companies fail to observe high standards of environmental, social, and governance performance, this has the potential to set back progress on some SDGs. So as consumer and stakeholder concerns over provenance and means of production of metals and minerals have increased, the industry has responded by developing a range of initiatives that establish standards for the responsible production of metals and minerals. Motivated by both consumer and stakeholder concerns, as well as an understanding of the interfaces between mining and the SDGs, ICMM developed its mining principles, which define good practice environmental, social, and governance requirements for the mining and metals industry through a comprehensive set of performance expectations. They seek to maximize the industry's benefit to host communities and minimize negative impacts to effectively manage issues of concern to society. They also respond to demand from consumers, investors, and other stakeholders that critically important raw materials be produced responsibly. Our starting point was to do a benchmarking exercise of over 30 external standards to really try and understand the normative societal expectations around responsible mining, and then identify perceived gaps in the obligations of membership at that time. Drawing upon this work, we drafted the performance expectations. We conducted an open global multi-stakeholder consultation on the draft in 2018 to solicit feedback on the extent to which they met stakeholder expectations of responsible mining. Organized under the umbrella of 10 principles that cover a range of environmental, social, and governance areas, our mining principles include 38 clear and specific performance expectations for members on a broad set of ESG issues. Examples include human rights due diligence, labor rights, resettlement, gender, access to grievance mechanisms, safety, risk management, mine closure, pollution, and waste. These performance expectations articulate what it takes to live up to the promise of the very aspirational wording of the principles. Members have also made additional commitments in ICMM position statements in areas such as climate change and indigenous peoples, which are linked to individual performance expectations and also part of the membership requirements. Now, until we'd introduced the mining principles, the main vehicle for members to demonstrate their commitments to membership was through their annual sustainability reports, which provide a corporate level overview of performance. But the mining principles apply to the asset level, and the disclosures that members have committed to will give customers, investors, and other stakeholders a line of sight to performance at the asset level. These asset level disclosures provide important insights into the quality of management for a broad range of sustainability concerns, many of which will never make it into the top tier of a company's most material issues from a sustainability reporting perspective, but which society cared deeply about. Lastly, since 2008, members have been required to have their annual sustainability reports independently assured, but this involved very limited reach to the asset level and only for those material issues that have been selected for third-party assurance. However, with the introduction of the mining principles, members have to initially undertake self-assessments of progress with implementation, followed by a robust third-party site-level validation of performance. And the outcomes of this will be also publicly disclosed. But let me stop there in the interest of time.
Aidan, thank you so much. We're at the end of our session, and I will pass over to Stefan in just a moment, but I just wanted to reflect on two things that I've really pulled out of the speaker's very, very interesting interventions. And I wish we had a lot longer, because I think there's a lot we could discuss together as well. But the first thing is that partnerships come in many forms, and collaboration comes in many forms. And we must remember this as we seek to collaborate in order to help achieve human rights, the SDGs and the Paris Climate Accords. But the other is that due diligence must be inclusive, and NGOs are an important part of ensuring that inclusion happens, and the evidence from Ricalto's work makes that clear. But in order to be inclusive, it's not just about programs and projects in technical assistance, it's also about rights, and especially human rights. And remembering the purpose of due diligence is to protect human rights. But if we carry out due diligence in ways that doesn't fully include vulnerable categories of individuals, then we're defeating the purpose. So we must remember to disaggregate and differentiate between those who have power and those who don't when we build systems to deliver due diligence in supply chains. Thank you for your attention, and Stefan, I'll pass back to you.
Thank you very much, Estelle, and thank you for all the speakers in the panel. It was very rich, also very thought-provoking and challenging on our, I think sometimes on our common sense thinking, and that we need to think more, especially I think from a European perspective. So without further ado, because the time indeed keeps on running when you have such interesting content, I would like to move to the last part of the session to listen to some ideas in Europe on how to make such an agenda more come true, how to drive that action, and what Estelle said about, and what Mrs. Dabala said about the inclusive due diligence, how to assure that. There are experience in the Netherlands with European sector dialogues, and we would like to hear from them. And then I would like to conclude with the direction that the German presidency is setting out on this topic. But first, I would like to go to Alexandra van Selm from the Dutch Socio-Economic Council. And the council just did evaluation of the specific Dutch approach on multi-stakeholder collaboration. So we would like to hear the lessons learned. It's a good moment for that. Alexandra, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Stefan, and an honor to be part of this very inspiring high-level session. The Social and Economic Council is the main advisory body to the Dutch government, and it consists of business representatives, unions, and independent members. And we have facilitated 9 sector agreements on responsible business conduct for the past couple of years. I would like to share some of our lessons with you and highlight the need for this type of multi-stakeholder collaboration at the European level. I think we need, or at the Council, we think we need ambitious mandatory due diligence legislation, inclusive due diligence legislation in the EU, but that alone will not be enough to reach significant impact in the supply chains, as many other speakers have also highlighted. We need a broad policy mix, and that should include European sector dialogue and joint action. And in this slide, you see an overview of the sector agreements to date. All agreements are a combination of firm and step-by-step commitments to implement due diligence according to the OECD guidelines and the UN guiding principles for business and human rights, and collective projects to jointly address specific issues in the supply chain. They are multi-stakeholder agreements between businesses, unions, NGOs, and government. If I could have the next slide, please. The Dutch Agreement on Sustainable Garments and Textiles is the most advanced of these agreements. And here are a few highlights from the 2019 annual report. This agreement covers about 40 to 50% of the market in the Netherlands, representing 84 labels and 61 companies. And adhering companies are obliged to provide their production locations, including beyond tier 1, and up to now more than 6,000 production locations are now online, predominantly in countries with high risks of adverse impact on people and the environment. And this is done through the Open Apparel Registry, which is an international database. Now, the parties to the agreement work together in multi-stakeholder projects, such as, for example, one on combating child labor in the garment supply chain in India and Bangladesh. And together, agreement companies, unions, NGOs, and their local counterparts collaborate in this. This is leading to several results, including 12,000 employees that now work in safer working conditions. Now, it's often challenging for Dutch companies to engage stakeholders in production countries effectively, and this is happening increasingly through the networks of the partnering unions and NGOs. And SOLIDARIDAD is also one of the NGOs involved in this agreement. So very happy to share that experience also here. The OECD has undertaken an alignment assessment of the agreement and concludes that the OECD guidelines are well applied by the agreement. Next slide, please. So what is key in these agreements is that they offer collaboration on the one hand and support on the other. And the issues in the supply chain, I think as other speakers have also highlighted, are often so complex that individual companies cannot address these effectively by themselves. This is why legislation is necessary, but not sufficient for positive impact in supply chains. Furthermore, increased transparency is key. Because the production locations in the textile agreement are online, local unions and NGOs can find these locations on the Open Apparel Registry and notify us if there is a problem at one of these factories. And this helps to close the global implementation gap. Moreover, the requirements are robust. They are based on the international guidelines and independently monitored. All the agreements also have paragraphs on access to remedy and collaborate with the Dutch National Contact Point for the OECD guidelines. And we are also looking into a joint accountability mechanism. Finally, the multi-stakeholder character and specifically the participation of unions and NGOs in these agreements prevent greenwashing and really give these agreements a very strong basis. Now, of course, there are also many challenges and there are also different agreements, and not all of them are working as effectively as the agreement on textiles and garments is. And there are challenges, which means that the impact up to now is suboptimal. First of all, the agreements are still predominantly national. And we're trying to change this, but this needs to accelerate, and it also needs high-level partnership. For example, the Garment and Textiles Agreement works closely together with the Textilbündnis in Germany. And I would love to hear Mr. Berning's ideas on how we can take this to the next level. Secondly, not all risks are covered. Not all those sectors are covered. And within sectors, it is hard to increase coverage as international players don't want to join national initiatives. This is why we need to complement EU due diligence legislation with EU sector agreements to implement this legislation in a way that will lead to actual positive impact in supply chains. Up to now, there has been limited involvement of local stakeholders in these agreements, and that also needs to change. Again, collaborating at the EU level will help to do this, as it will make the investments on behalf of producers more worthwhile, also in relation to, for example, auditing fatigue and other issues that were mentioned today. And there are also challenges related to competition law and commercial interests, which I will leave for now. So where does that leave us? Last slide, please. The Dutch government has evaluated their RBC policy over the last year, and this is the model they have come up with, which is also endorsed by the SER. We need a broad European policy mix, which takes into account all the different elements that are necessary for companies to implement due diligence in a way that is going to lead to positive impact. Mandatory legislation is an important part of that equation, but this is not enough. We need European sector dialogue, and more importantly, we need that dialogue to lead to joint action so that sustainable supply chains become a reality on the ground. That was what I wanted to share with you today. In the interest of time, I will share some links in the chat, and really look forward to hear from all of you how we can collaborate in this further. Thank you.
Alexandra, thank you very much. It was very interesting, and I think it also reiterates a number of points that were made earlier in the panel debate, investing in the link between supply chains and NGO networks, but also engaging the local stakeholders to avoid the risk that Estelle summarized from her session, the risk of defeating the purpose of the due diligence law. So thank you very much for sharing those insights from the Dutch experience. Without further ado, I would like now to go to our last speaker, which is Mr. Beuning, the Permanent State Secretary of the Ministry of Labour and Social Affairs. Germany is having its German presidency of the European Union at the moment, and did earlier this month a major conference on this topic of supply chain due diligence. Mr. Beuning, I hope the technology allows us, and we would like to give the floor to you immediately.
Yeah, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for having me in this impressive conference, and thank you to CSR Europe for organizing this wonderful conference. I think it's the right time to discuss about our due diligence issues. The protection of human rights and the enforcement of decent working conditions along global supply chains are priority issues of the German Labour Ministry during our EU presidency. Human rights and decent working conditions are not given for everyone all over the world. The corona crisis has worsened the already precarious situation of parts of the workforce and all tiers of global supply chains. Especially women, children, and migrant workers are affected and experience disproportionate business-related human and labor rights abuses. We are still far away from achieving the SDGs. Still, almost 25 million people worldwide are being exploited in forced labor, and almost 1 in 10 children is a victim of child labor. With the COVID-19 pandemic, we even faced the risk of reverting years of progress. Achieving the SDGs is only possible if we strengthen corporate responsibility. Especially globally active companies must implement their human rights due diligence as laid down in the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. In particular, the EU has a global economic power, is bound by its values, and should step all efforts to implement human rights and decent work in global supply chains. We believe that this time to act is now. And it is time for coherent and ambitious action on an EU level. A lot of member states of the European Union, European Commission, European social partners, companies, and consumers speak in favor of ambitious and coherent action to enforce human rights due diligence and decent work in global supply chains. A strong message was, for example, given with the opinion on sustainable group supply chains just recently adopted by European Economic and Social Committee. It calls on the Commission to develop an EU action plan on human rights, decent work, and environmental sustainability in global supply chains. And they call for a binding cross-sectoral legislative initiative on human rights due diligence in order to level the playing field. We believe that now there is a right momentum for action on EU level to launch a new coherent strategy. What is needed is an EU action plan on human rights and decent work in global supply chains. An EU action plan should include a variety of measures such as binding human rights due diligence, quality criteria for national action plans on businesses and human rights, further measures to combat child and forced labor, as well as supporting measures such as European sector dialogues. We greatly support the intention by Employment Commissioner Schmidt to update his 26th communication on decent work for all in the world. An EU action plan could be ideal in complementing an updated decent work agenda. Within our presidency, we want to further encourage the European Commission to make decent work for all one of its priorities, including mandatory due diligence. We therefore strongly support the initiative announced by Commissioner Reinders to launch EU human rights and environmental due diligence legislation in the coming year. Although the UN guiding principles were adopted almost 10 years ago, only a minority of European businesses undertakes comprehensive human rights due diligence along the entire supply chain. This was confirmed by recent studies. The results of a Commission study show that only 16% of companies undertake due diligence, which takes into account all human rights and environmental impacts and cover the entire supply chains. More than 80% don't. This was also confirmed by our monitoring in the context of our national action plan. This shows that voluntary measures are not enough. They alone are unable to significantly change the way businesses manage human rights and bring about the cultural changes within companies we need so badly. As a result, in Germany, we are now working on the draft proposal of our national due diligence law. We believe that any due diligence legislation should cover all human rights, all sectors, companies with more than 500 employees, not merely very large companies. And it must include clear rules of liability and apply to all tiers of the supply chain. At the same time, it needs to be manageable, proportional, and take into account the needs of smaller enterprises. Many companies are in fact in favor of legislation as it would provide them with legal certainty. Passing human rights due diligence legislation does, however, not mean that voluntary measures become obsolete or become less important. However, they alone do not bring about the needed change of businesses' action. We need a smart mix of binding and non-binding measures, both complementing each other. In this context, European sector dialogues play a crucial role. They can help companies to address human rights risk along their global supply chains. Therefore, sector dialogues should follow a multi-stakeholder approach. They should bring together business associations, trade unions, civil society organizations, and public authorities to achieve a common understanding of the sector's specific challenges and solution approaches needed. A joint action increases influence and facilitates results on site. In Germany, the Labor Ministry facilitates the first sector dialogues with the automotive industry as part of our national action plan on businesses and human rights. It includes, besides the companies of Germany's automotive industry, also business associations, trade unions, and civil society. The dialogue aims to improve the human rights situation, have an impact on the ground. For example, a joint concept is currently being developed to pilot different approaches to certification at selected copper mines. We believe that the various activities on national levels should be brought together and coordinated at a EU level. Any further European human rights due diligence legislation or supply chain law will only be effective if it is tightly coupled with sector and cross-sectoral dialogues. In particular, SMEs would benefit by learning from larger companies and sharing resources with each other. EU sectoral dialogues should therefore be an important aspect of an EU action plan on human rights and decent work global supply chains. To sum up in a simple way, the time to act is now. This was the common understanding of all stakeholders and participants of our own conference on human rights and decent work at the beginning of October. During the remaining months of our presidency, we want to encourage the Commission to continue the path taken and to give impetus for EU legislation on binding due diligence and for an EU action plan. We aim to adopt ambitious Council conclusions in the Employment Council at the beginning of December. Let's join our forces to work together to achieve a level playing field for companies and to implement decent work worldwide. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister, for this important contribution. And I'm looking at the time, and I'm afraid I have to close the session rather abruptly with some quick conclusion. I believe, and we see that throughout the summit, and we all agree on the what, specifically on that one, about on the one we have at hand today, the protection of environment, human rights, and decent work conditions. We also agree on the why we have to do it. We all understand, even, well, because of the COVID situation, even more, the Sustainable Development Goals need to be achieved. So the why is also clear. It's about the how. How can we achieve that purpose? Minister Al-Mashhad opened, as she said, it's about partnerships for action. She emphasized the action element. And I just pick up some elements. Dr. Van Zyl from Toyota then said, but it will have to start within the company's purpose, within the culture, and within the management processes to be able to work with the suppliers to achieve that. And we cannot do it alone, he also said. We need to collaborate. And also, Mr. Sun, Mr. Davy demonstrated this direction of collaboration and the work that's going on. But then I think also in Estelle's panel, there was a warning. It should be inclusive. Mr. Manvanda, Mrs. Daugabala, we need to engage local stakeholders. We need to look to see, to be on the ground, to see the effect of what we are trying to do, of our action. And for me, when I saw those slides from this lady farmer, and after all this certification and fair trade and saying the situation did not improve after 20 years, it puts a lot of challenge to us, I think, and we should question ourselves. It was very speaking to me. We should not do it from a distance, and we need this kind of insights. But therefore, all the more important is what Kundun's proposes, and we need to have the right financial instruments. And what just the minister was saying, these European sector platforms, they are maybe the right way to link company supply chain efforts with the efforts of civil society, of labor unions, of NGOs, but on the work on the ground, not on the work in Brussels or in Berlin or whatever, on the work on the ground. If the European sector dialogues can have the platform to discuss that and then lead to action, I think we can get a step further in the direction that was outlined by our panelists and speakers. I'm sorry for my bad time management. I'm sorry to have kept you all longer. I thank again, really very genuinely and enthusiastically, all the speakers. Estelle, as a moderator, I think you made it all a great session, and thank you for the insights and learning that I could receive on that and that we could receive from you. Thank you all very much. And later this afternoon, there are again other sessions. But thank you for this session today.